to the event. My name is Erik Hendricks. I'm a visiting fellow here at the Danube Institute. And this evening we're going to speak about female leadership, specifically female conservative leadership. And I thought I would cite Mao Zedong, who's of course a favorite of conservative gatherings. Mao Zedong said, "Women can hold up half the sky." It's a very beautiful phrase, and Mao in fact wrote poetry. He had a lot of beautiful phrases. His political practice was a bit different, but that's not the topic of this evening. So female conservative leadership. To address this topic is Lana Starkey, who has been with us now for a few months, and she is a visiting fellow here at the Danube Institute, and she's from Australia, and she's currently also still, I think you still have also the title, at the Melbourne Public Affairs Institute. And that she's a researcher. So I'll give the floor to Lana. She will be speaking for a bit longer because we don't have a panel format this evening. We'll instead have a longer lecture. So we'll practice our attention span. And but it's an important topic, so she will be speaking for roughly 50 minutes. So here we go. Lana.
Thank you, Eric. This is good. Okay, so women and the politics of conservative renewal. So I started writing this talk at the weekend and today, really. And I just added the crisis of representation because that is really what this talk will be about a lot. Then, of course, women, identity, and we cannot forget the culture war issues. But I would like to begin just talking a little bit about where I'm from, the environment where this project sort of began to germinate, where the idea of the need for women, where a need for the politics of conservative renewal became apparent to me, and to explain about how, when thinking this through, women came to stand out and need to be taken seriously in a way that I don't think has been. So my project germinated at my time at the Institute of Public Affairs in Melbourne. The IPA is Australia's oldest right-wing think tank, and I continue to work part-time for the IPA, as Eric mentioned. I write remotely now for them from Budapest, and my decision to stay in Europe for longer, I think, will make sense as my talk unfolds. But while I was in Melbourne, on the ground, so to speak, last year, I was living under a hard left Labour government. Melbourne is the capital city of Victoria, which was then under the rule of Daniel Andrews. It's now run by his predecessor, Jacinta Allen, who is also Labour government. The left is still in power. But you may know the name Daniel Andrews because it was Daniel Andrews who was responsible for putting Melbourne on the map in recent years. And this was not for its tremendous cafe culture or for its art scene, but for being the longest continually locked down place on the planet during the COVID pandemic. So this was hell, as you can imagine, and the consequences are indeed still being felt in Australia. There's much to be said on that. However, it's not the hard left in Australia that I would like to talk about tonight, but the centre-right. And this is because what struck me most and continues to strike me about the centre-right in Australia is its capitulation to left-wing dogma, particularly on what we might call cultural issues. Its surrender to the woke zeitgeist. And there was one event in particular that really mobilized me, that really kicked off the beginnings of this project. And this was the expulsion of a young Conservative MP, Moira Deeming, from the Victorian Liberal Party. So just quickly, for those of you who don't know Australian politics that well, the Liberal Party are very similar to the British Conservative Party. So Aussie Tories, if you will. And the party holds like a mainstream centre-right position that could be described as classical liberal or liberal conservative. It tends to promote economic liberalism and social conservatism. So at the federal level, it's in a coalition with the National Party, who are again more conservative. And like the Tories, of course, there are factions within the Liberal Party. But on the whole, and indeed traditionally, it is a solid centre-right party. And it has produced some of our greatest prime ministers. The founder of the party, Sir Robert Menzies. Then John Howard, of course, comes to mind as one of our longest-serving and greatest prime ministers. And then, of course, more recently, the Honourable Tony Abbott, who I believe who's a great friend of the Institute, the Danube Institute, and who I believe will be talking here in a couple of weeks. Tony is also a fellow of mine at the IPA in Melbourne. So, in short, the Liberal Party, they are supposed to be the good guys and girls in Australia. So, why did the Victorian Liberal Party expel this young conservative woman? What was her crime? Well, the supposed crime was to have attended a women's rights activist, to join this women's rights activist, Kelly J. Keane, who is also known as Posy Parker, at a rally in Melbourne early last year. So Kelly J. Keane is a British women's rights activist. She's a founder of the group Let Women Speak. So this group and Keane have been described by the left, of course, as transphobic, and they're fighting against the assault on biological women that we see across the West. So Keane is opposed to the UK Gender Recognition Act, the use of public bathrooms by transgender people and also transgender people in sports. And this is, of course, when they insist on entering the bathrooms or competing in the sports, not in terms of biological sex, but as their gender, self-proclaimed gender. And significantly, she also opposes puberty blockers and hormone replacement therapy for children. And this has become a really serious problem across the West, as concerning as the crisis in education, which I work on a lot for the IPA. But that is Frankenstein stuff. But her group Let Women Speak and this rally was particularly focused on the word woman as language that clearly defines women's rights and indeed is essential to protecting those rights. And so the mission statement is that it is essential that this word is retained to mean adult human female only. Without this word, all of our rights and protections are lost. Our rights were never created for our gender, but for our sex. So this should really be straightforward, non-controversial stuff. But as we know, the world has gone completely topsy-turvy. And J.K. Rowling, of course, has recently been in the news on this, and I thought I'd briefly mention her here. So J.K. Rowling, like Kelly J. Keane, has for some time now been very active in defending women's rights against the trans lobby, mostly on Twitter. And this dates back to 2019, when she was then just the Harry Potter lady. She then became something different because she supported a gender-critical campaigner, Maya Forstater, who was then in a legal battle with her employer, who had fired her for expressing so-called anti-trans views. So since then, J.K. Rowling has really been at the forefront of what has been really a war of words on women's rights and also on issues of freedom of speech. So the latest development in this saga is that on the 1st of April, in response to Scotland's hate crime and Public Order Act coming into effect, Rowling posted a thread to Twitter, which was a series of images of transgender convicted criminals, celebrities, and prominent activists. And she, throughout this thread, just sarcastically described them as female. At the end, she then wrote, "Obviously, the people mentioned in the above tweets aren't women at all, but men, every last one of them." And the idea here, of course, was to challenge Scotland's new hate crime law. Rowling was, of course, reported for her tweets by many for hate. but they were assessed by the police as not criminal. And so this is a win that has been much celebrated. And this is because the point is really a larger one that she's been making for some time, and that is one about the erosion of protections for women, particularly in the UK. In Scotland, men convicted of crimes, sexual assaults against women and rapes, they have been convicted as men, and then seemingly overnight they have decided that they are women trapped in men's body and are now identify as trans women, and then they have been placed in female prisons. So a case of this, of course, led to Nicola Sturgeon's resignation early last year, and she infamously, when pressed to give a definition of a woman, could not do so. So, although these issues, all this talk about words and the need to remind people of what are simply biological facts, may seem completely bonkers to an outsider, there are really serious major issues in the Anglosphere. And so a rally like Kellie J. Keen's was seen as important for many women, and indeed men, and for this Conservative MP, Moira Deeming, who of course attended. So what on earth happened? Well, as ever, there are complications that in the story that blur the edges. So the rally was invaded by about 30 young men who are members of this small, mostly online group, and they describe themselves, unfortunately, as National Socialists. The Nazis. So they were there as hooligans to cause trouble and fight with the trans radicals who were protesting against Kellie J. Keen and women's rights activists. So they held banners with slogans like that read like "Destroy pedo freaks," and then the police, bizarrely, moronically, let them move into the Let Women Speak buffer zone, and this is like on the steps of Victorian Parliament, and there they were able to deliver the Nazi salute. This was, of course, all captured on video. So the incident gave opponents of the protest license to slur the women's speech organisers as in bed with white supremacists. Victoria's Labour Party Premier, Daniel Andrews, known as Dictator Dan in Australia, predictably jumped at the opportunity to tar Deeming and the Let Women Speak protest with a crude fascist brush. Nazis aren't welcome, Andrews said. Their evil ideology is to scapegoat minorities. That's got no place here. Those who stand with them don't either. So on. So this was all very predictable from the left. What was not, however, was the response from the right. Deeming's party, the Liberals. In the aftermath of the rally, the leader of the Victorian Liberal Party, John Pesutto, announced his intention to expel her. He stated, "This is not an issue about free speech, but a member of the parliamentary party associating with people whose views are abhorrent to my values, the values of the Liberal Party and the wider community." And I'll have more to say on the values of the Liberal Party in a bit. So some in the party assumed that he had reacted impetuously and would back down. Instead, he doubled down. He refused to back away from his assertion that Deeming and the Nazis were somehow in cahoots. And the party then had to vote on this. And this is the elected Liberals voting in a room, not the members of the party. And they voted to expel Deeming. So Pesutto's inability to compromise, to find space for Deeming, reveals a lot about the state of the centre-right in Australia for me. Pesutto wants to modernise the Victorian Liberal Party, which means moving it towards the perceived centre of political opinion. And it does not help that he represents the seat of Hawthorn in the wealthy eastern suburbs of Melbourne. His constituency is heavily populated by university-educated professionals with luxury beliefs in climate change and other hot-button social issues of the day. So as a result of this, perhaps, Deeming's belief that sex is determined by biology is now considered an extreme position in the Liberal Party. This is the message in the centre-right of Australia. And this is not just a one-off incident. So the Liberals have allowed other radical bills to pass through Parliament, such as the bill that purported to outlaw gay conversion therapy. So this bill had very little to do with gay conversion therapy, a practice which almost every Australian, Christian or non-Christian, would abhor. And I very much doubt that very much or any of this was going on in Australia. Nevertheless, the bill was presented as a victory over bigotry, prejudice, and hate speech that would end an injustice overlooked by previous generations. In reality, it was a Trojan horse for radical gender activism and effectively mandated a practice known as gender-affirming care. So now, if a teenager presents to a doctor claiming, for example, that they are a girl trapped in a boy's body, the doctor must accept this as the final and unchallengeable diagnosis, and parents have no say. This now means that while a person under the age of 18 must seek the approval of a responsible adult to get a tattoo, they do not need such approval in order to change their gender. So we're talking about children here, and this has had big effects in schools, as you can imagine. Again, this was all under the watch of the Victorian Liberal Party, who have capitulated to the radical left. They're not practicing what they preach. It's just not cricket. So trans activism is the antithesis of the liberalism of Edmund Burke, a philosophical marker stone for Australian liberalism. It is also opposed to the pro-family egalitarianism of the Liberal Party's founder, Robert Menzies. It is an attack on the institution of the family, the foundation of social stability in liberal thought. It is an ideology that hastens the demise of citizenship. In Australia, the notion that everyone is equal under law and that race, biology, or any other form of identity is subservient to our common national identity. So what has happened to the centre-right in Victoria and in Australia, I see as part of a larger existential crisis in the West, whereby establishment conservatives have found themselves faced with an increasingly loud and increasingly powerful radical left that are hell-bent on dismantling traditional institutions, traditional understandings, truth, reality, and indeed are attacking Western civilization itself. The Trojan Horse Bill mandating gender-affirming care is an example of just how pernicious these attacks are becoming, how identity politics is being weaponized by a left that is anti-democratic, and crucially, how establishment centre-right representatives are seemingly just allowing the woke to wash over them. So why and how, why is this happening? What is the woke? So there are many ways you can try to explain woke and the left's seemingly inexhaustible need to find sins to atone for. You can debate about where this ideology came from, how it took hold, whether it's a new form of Marxism or not, etc., etc. It has been done to death. Diagnosing the problem is now an industry in itself. There are new books out on this every other week. Declinist literature is at an all-time high, and we are constantly told that the West is finished, or that it is finishing, and that we must fight in the culture war. So I've read these books, and I agree with them largely, of course. On the screen, there's one of the originals, Oswald's, of course. And then Douglas Murray, who is tremendous on this, particularly on identity and immigration. But for me, when thinking through wokeism and the attack on the Western tradition that the right is facing, all that really matters is that we recognize the philosophical bones of the movement. So where it is coming from on a philosophical level. And I think the best way to get straight to the point on this is to realize with Nietzsche that God is dead. And so I say this not just with Nietzsche in mind, I say this to evoke Nietzsche, to bring Nietzsche into the room, and to an extent Heidegger with him. So when I say God is dead, I'm not talking about the decline of a belief in God or the waning of faith across the West. I'm talking about Nietzsche's observation in the late 19th century that by killing God, man killed the broader idea of the universal and of transcendent truth. By God is dead, Nietzsche really meant that truth is dead, and Heidegger understood this to be the death of metaphysics. So why does all this philosophy matter now? Well, it's what all of the wokeism is based on. It's how their logic works. Wokeism is a form of postmodernism, which itself is old. All that is new is that it has been weaponized big time by the radical left. So for the woke radicals, any assertion of a fact, for example, a woman is an adult human female, this is merely another competing smokescreen for the imposition of power. There's no truth, only power. So having rendered all knowledge relative, they insist that it becomes politically acceptable to impose their agenda in the name of social justice. You cannot reason with these people. They are playing a zero-sum game, and unfortunately, you cannot pray them away. So if we are in this situation where we are truly beyond good and evil, if the West is really finished or finishing, why should we bother? Many commentators are increasingly observing how wokeism and talking about the culture wars is not only irritating, but it distracts from so-called real politics, economics and geopolitics, for example. And they argued that if we focus on more concrete and traditionally political issues, maybe the question of identity will, which is really a pre-political question, maybe it will simply resolve itself, and or the tide may begin to turn. Maybe we are reaching a peak woke. And I think the leader of the Victorian Liberal Party clumsily expressed this sentiment when he was taken to task for expelling Deeming from the Liberal Party. And in response, he simply stated that Deeming's concerns about women's rights were a distraction from the state budget and the need to hold Labour government account for bad economic management. Now, these are the words of a cynical, self-interested politician, and so I will respond in turn with my own deeply cynical view. I propose that we take the enfant terrible of French literature, Michel Houellebecq, seriously on issues of identity and what is really at stake here, and crucially, who might be part of the problem. So in Houellebecq's novel Submission, for example, he provocatively suggests that yielding to the rule of Islam, with its reassuring social and sexual hierarchies, might be a good option for an otherwise terminal Europe. So now Submission was published in 2015, and somewhat infamously, the Charlie Hebdo attacks occurred hours after its release. But I won't go into any of that today, but it is a story, but it's not relevant. All that is important for now is to know that the novel was written in 2015, but it is set in a future, 2022, and it depicts a total upheaval of French society, whereby the presidential election is won by a Muslim party, with which the left collaborates with in order to keep the National Front from power. And as a result, France becomes a Muslim state. So in the novel, Houellebecq suggests that atheist materialism and the harshness of the sexual free market offer only sorrow and lack of meaning, whereas political Islam delivers purpose, stability, truckloads of Saudi and Qatari money, multiple wives for the men, and lives of fulfilling submission for the women. What's not to love? So, rather than being a dark vision of a world ruled by mad mullahs, Houellebecq presents moderate Muslims who take over France as a force of spiritual integrity and revolutionary verve, a historic opportunity for the moral and familial rearmament of Europe. So, this is very dark satire, of course. And the real targets of the book are France's bloated institutions, its venal politicians, and of course, for Houellebecq, the arrogant French novelist, as always, France's sclerotic literary scene. So, in Submission, Houellebecq is saying that French society, in the form of its politicians, journalists, and academics, will get exactly what it deserves, a state run by those who believe in something bigger and grander than the perf and perquisites of their elevated positions. It is the intellectual and political classes on the left, but we now see them in the center-right, the establishment, among whom no trace of idealism is found, not a shadow of will to defend any set of values, and when we look to them, we only find brutal and cynical pragmatism. So much for representation. And the protagonist of the novel sums up this mood when he states of the regime change, what has to happen will happen, and compares the passivity of the elite with that which made it possible for Hitler to come to power in 1933, when people lulled themselves into believing that he would eventually come to his senses and conform. So this is a very, very sickly vision, the rise of a caliphate or any other anti-democratic nightmare, but it is hard to look away. Tempting as it may be, we can't pretend that something like this is maybe happening, and the centre-right, particularly those in power, are merely watching on like Eichmanns. In any case, they no longer stand for or even give voice to many of the issues we are facing. Any claims that we have reached peak woke from politicians don't make sense when woke and cultural issues have now become legal issues in the West. Issues of policy, they have moved beyond the ivory tower, beyond the internet. They now intrude on people's rights and everyday lives. Voters care, and rightly so. And we know this because when people have been allowed to vote on issues of identity, they have overwhelmingly voted against leftist divisive identity politics and changes to the status quo. So recent referendums have shown this. The Voice to Parliament in Australia, which proposed to divide our country by race, was overwhelmingly rejected by the public. More recently in Ireland, the proposed amendment to widen the definition of family from one based on marriage to one based on durable relationships was repudiated by the public with 67% voting no. And the Care Amendment, which proposed to remove a reference to mothers' duties in the home, was defeated by an even bigger landslide. 74% voted this down. So it's quite obvious to me that what woke and the culture wars have revealed is that the mainstream right faces a crisis of representation. This is a major problem, and it is of course tied to the rise of so-called populism. However, the mainstream right has up until this point and continues to see this populism as threatening the political stability of democracies. And I think that this is a major concern, and I think it's a fair point. So, unlike Wilbeck, I'm not a radical conservative who sees the world in dark, sublime terms, as morbidly attractive and entertaining as I may find this. My conservatism is more marked by a tendency to react impassively to the manias and tantrums of modern life. It's a disposition marked by skepticism to any form of enthusiasm, and marked by irony and humor. I do not like any sort of ideology, left or even conservative. So I think we need appropriate representation, a middle way, or some sort of sense of consensus. But I do see populism and its potential threat to democracy as largely the fault of the centre-right, specifically its wider failure to appreciate the virtue and the necessity of representation. So here I look to Burke, and Burke, when considering Rousseau, recognized that democracies are held together by something stronger than politics. There is a first-person plural, a pre-political loyalty, which causes neighbors who voted in opposing ways to treat each other as fellow citizens for whom the government is not mine or yours, but ours, whether or not we approve of it. And this is how it is all supposed to work. Democracy and representation are based on a pre-political trust. But what happens when that trust disintegrates? In particular, what happens when issues closest to people's hearts are neither discussed nor mentioned by their representatives, and when these issues are precisely issues of identity, of who we are, and what unites us? So we need to remember that political questions are of two distinct kinds: those that concern how we should be governed, and those that concern who we are. And we're at the point where we can no longer ignore the question of who we are. So here we're faced with the problem of building a conservative consensus on pre-political questions of identity. And my approach is to follow Roger Scruton, who evokes Burke here, in his idea of finding and preserving little platoons. And so he writes, "Little platoons are the places where traditions form. Social traditions," Burke pointed out, "are forms of knowledge. They contain the residues of many trials and errors and the inherited solutions to problems that we all encounter. Like those cognitive abilities that predate civilization, they are adaptations, but adaptations of community rather than of individual organism. Social traditions exist because they enable a society to reproduce itself. Destroy them heedlessly, and you remove the guarantee offered by one generation to the next. So, in line with this view, it's a view of government whereby government exists in order to conciliate opposing views, manage conflicts, to ensure peaceful transactions between citizens as they compete in the market and associate in what Burke calls these little platoons, something which cannot be achieved under the rule of rogue ideologues. And so this leads me to why Hungary? Why am I here? So I found in Hungary a place where little platoons exist, where by its very nature and by its history, Hungary holds onto and nurtures these little platoons or traditions that constitute and ensure its survival, its identity. And so although I've just said that I'm tired of declinist literature and laments on a decadent West, I will briefly sketch a brief account of how I came to see the troubled West through its relationship to Central Europe, particularly after the fall of communism. So I came to thinking about Central Europe and the crisis of culture in the West by reading Milan Kundera, in particular a short essay he wrote in 1983 called A Kidnapped West, The Tragedy of Central Europe. So this essay was a very big deal at the time, and it set off a tidal wave of reactions across Europe. It prompted polemics from Russia and Germany in the East. But Kundera's provocative move was to confront a West that he argued no longer saw Central Europe as anything more than part of the Eastern Bloc. The West, he contended, had largely ignored the nations of Hungary, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, regarding them as irretrievably part of the East. Their very culture and history remorselessly assimilated into the Russian worldview. And in defense of these small nations, Kundera argued powerfully that far from being culturally assimilated, the countries of Central Europe always were a part of the West, and indeed their culture was and remains the sanctuary of their identity. So in 1983, the fact that the West had not even noticed the disappearance and significance of these small nations was symptomatic of a larger crisis, one whereby the West no longer had any meaningful understanding of itself or its own cultural role. So Kundera notes how European unity was once based on a shared religion, a medieval Christianity, and that after man killed God, things were okay enough as culture came to fill this void. So this is culture as the expression of the supreme values by which European humanity understood itself, defined itself, and identified itself as European. And so we might call this Western civilization, truth, beauty, objectivity, values that we see preserved in these little platoons and in tradition, and cultural Christianity might also fit in here. But by 1983, however, and I think that dates are important here, Kundera is writing in the new postmodern age, and he asserted that another transformation had occurred in the West, just as God long ago gave way to culture, culture is in turn giving way. He declared that in Western Europe, culture had bowed out, and that the real tragedy for Central Europe was not Russia, but Europe itself. So, for me, 40 years later, and I think that this is still the case, but the tragedy for Central Europe is the European Union. And we find those small European nations that Kundera observed hold so fast to their distinctive cultures, Poland, Hungary, and Slovakia, at the behest of a totalizing European Union where culture has not only bowed out, but has been replaced by the woke liberal values of an expert class of unelected technocrats and supranational elites. But Hungary is an exceptionally successful conservative outlier in this heavily woke EU-dominated Europe. And so while the West and the Anglosphere have no culture, only culture wars, Hungary holds fast to its culture and its identity and its sovereignty. And so the West and the Anglosphere at this moment have a lot to learn from this. And many are looking to take lessons from Hungary on these problems of identity and building a coherent conservative consensus. And I join them in this endeavor. But so far, I don't think that these other commentators have really solved the pre-political problem. And I do think that it's very, very difficult for the West, as our problems really run so deep. But I think that we can begin by trying to reclaim reality, at least, and working on representation. And this is where women come in. I think that they may be the way forward. That's my argument. So far, a number of commentators have observed that strongmen politicians might begin to start playing an important role, considering the way that the center of politics has hollowed out. So we find Trump, and to an extent Boris Johnson, that they were illustrative of this style. Interestingly, we are also seeing strongmen politicians appear on the left. And I think Sanchez in Spain is a good example of this. He's an excellent political operator. He has what they call chancismo. It's a big thing in Spain. So this is interesting, but it's a worry for the right. So this is the men, but what about the women? So this is significant that there are also a growing number of more effective and plausible strong women leaders who have appeared across Europe, such as Meloni, Le Pen, and the one that I will focus on most at the end here is Isabel Diaz Ayuso. She's a really, really interesting figure. So these women, as well as a growing number of female politicians and prominent female activists, have proven to be successful and indeed have cut across party lines on cultural issues such as gender, the family, and education, as well as immigration and the nation state. But we might ask, maybe a bit more generally, why women? Just a general question. So interestingly, only the left have really looked closely at this emergence of conservative, or what they will call far-right, or populist female politicians and figures. And so you only really find discussions on this in places like The Guardian, and of course convoluted, theory-laden academic journals and book chapters. But there's much to learn from these takes. So I'll quickly cycle through a few good points that the left make that I sort of agree with. The first one, gender, family, and the nation state. So the first part there, I wouldn't bother so much about it. This is the left's theory, academic take on gender and what they're worried about. So they're worried about the fact that everyone can relate to gender, that gender plays a crucial role in what they call a national populist project of ethnic or national homogeneity and exclusionary citizenship in the biopolitical arrangements. Okay, for me, all this translates into is, one, yes, everyone can relate to gender. Over half of the voting population are women. Two, women are the basis of the family. And following Burke, the family is the origin of the little platoon we belong to in society. This is essential for any coherent understanding of the nation state. Women and the family are important for political arrangements and coherent understandings of this. So when they say national homogeneity and exclusionarity, I see coherence and traditional understandings, and I see the small building blocks for sovereignty. And I'll note Hungary on this, Hungary here, their family policies in particular. So I've written on this and lessons that Australia can learn from Hungary, particularly on demography, and the need for Australia to focus more on family rather than just productivity when considering the demography crisis and policy surrounding that. The next point is pretty easy, immigration. So, this is from the left. Right-wing populist parties are specifically targeting women with a controversial and contested message that immigration, particularly from Muslim countries, brings with it misogynistic cultures that threaten women's freedom in Europe, from catcalling women in short skirts to sexual assault. As Le Pen put it, I'm scared that the migrant crisis signals the beginning of the end of women's rights. Okay, well, I'm scared too. So, this is a problem, right? So, it is the paradox of tolerance that the left fall prey to when it comes to immigration and women's rights. And women are more able to speak out about this than men are, I think. They are less likely to be called racist for doing so. And so I think when Le Pen says every woman must be protected in their right to wear a miniskirt, yes. And I don't think that that is too conservative or populist or right-wing at all. And a similar sort of thing applies when we look at the trans issue, as we've seen in the work done by women's rights activists. And so, again, it's perhaps by being women, rather than women identifying biological males, that women are better able to speak to the problem and to reveal it for what it is, which is not only an attack on traditional understandings, but an attack on truth. It's an attack on reality. So this is a really easy way to start to reclaim reality. And we might note that this issue really does cut across party lines. We find Germaine Greer, for example, once the radical leftist from the 70s, she's now been cancelled, and seen as conservative. And the similar sort of thing goes for feminist philosophers such as Kathleen Stock, a Brit, and Material Girls. This is a very good book on why reality matters for feminism. The next point. So I think that women's roles are sort of increasingly becoming quite flexible, and the left don't get it here. So one, the left cannot understand, firstly, why a woman would vote conservative, and secondly, they do not understand why a woman would want to be a conservative representative or politician. The left think that they must be brainwashed. So this blindness from the left is very useful for the right, and I think that women, conservative women, can be, as they say here. Thatcher famously kept cooking dinner at Downing Street, or von der Leyen with her 7 children. Okay, but then they get confused when Le Pen is twice divorced and Meloni is a single mother, and so on. I think that no one is so bothered about this anymore. It doesn't really matter. And this is because of changes in society that are really very much in the Anglosphere and also in Northern European countries. Might be different elsewhere. But in the Anglosphere, definitely, we are so down the rabbit hole that no one pays that much attention anymore to private lives or personal lives, or traditional female roles. And this applies to men as well. You have gays, you probably always did, on the right, but I think that women do have it easier. And I think what really actually matters more is that whether they are traditionally feminine or not, women do in all cases soften the strongman right-wing image, and this is especially important in Europe because of recent history. And I think Meloni is an example of a woman that has done quite well on this front. So she has had some trouble disassociating her party from its past, but I think that if she was a man, this would be far more difficult. So this flexibility and sort of maybe small changes in understandings of the role of women or how women are seen brings me to the future. And I think the future is young and social media savvy women. So this is Els van Doesburg. She is an increasingly popular figure in Flanders, a rising star of the New Flemish Alliance. She is currently the councillor for Antwerp. And so before she went into politics proper, she was a journalist, and she's written a lot calling out the woke. She recently tore to shreds the progressive feminist Björk Pernell on a widely broadcast International Women's Day panel, arguing that modern feminism is part of an all-encompassing progressive victim industry, and that the hashtag #MeToo is old. So, as a young, outspoken, but very popular and social media savvy woman who both describes herself as an Insta-conservative and considers Roger Scruton one of her idols, she looks very, very promising indeed for me for the future. And Eric has put me in touch with her kindly, so I hope to talk to her soon at some point. And finally, I will turn to the one to watch. So if I was a betting woman, and I am, I would be putting money on this lady. Yes, this is Isabel Ayuso. So she is currently the president of Madrid, and she's a member of Spain's People's Party, the PP. And she's currently serving her second term as president of Madrid. But when she was first elected, she was elected 6 months after the pandemic hit in Spain, and she just refused to lock down Madrid. So the city had the most relaxed restrictions in the country, and she became basically the unofficial patron saint of Madrid's theaters, shops, and the hospitality industry. The city was gripped by this Ayuso mania. So posters of her, accompanied by the word libertad, became a common sight behind bars in Madrid. Her face appeared on the label of a craft beer, and this is interesting. Ayuso-style papas became this popular dish, and they came with 2 extra eggs, or huevos, and this was a reference to this Spanish expression's other meaning, which means with a pair of balls. So you'd order the Ayuso dish, and it would come with a pair of balls. So she was re-elected more recently, and she is still known as Saint Isabel in Madrid. She is very outspoken on woke, so she is conservative on social issues, and she is libertarian, basically libertarian, when it comes to economics. So post-COVID, she cut taxes and red tape in a suite of open market policies that saw Madrid attract $15.3 billion in foreign investment. Growth climbed 2 points above the national average of 5.7%, and saw Madrid overtake Catalonia as Spain's richest region. So while her territory has been Madrid, she has always presented herself as in opposition to Sanchez. She's been doing this for years. So Sanchez is the hard left, anti-democratic, but very politically savvy current leader of the country. And so I think that the PP would have seriously considered putting her forward as party leader. And I think they had this in mind for the future, but last summer Sanchez called a very calculated snap election. So this was off the cards for the PP and for Ayuso, and we saw the outcome of that. And so I was in Spain last summer following this election, and I was in Madrid, and I witnessed Ayuso mania and firsthand, and what she has done for the city. And so if I may circle back to the beginning of my talk, Ayuso is the antithesis of dictator Dan. Madrid is the opposite of Melbourne. This is the future, so she is the future that I want to see, and I think that any conservative renewal must start with something like this. Thank you.
Thank you, Lana. Wow, you covered quite some ground.
Yeah.
First, before we turn to the audience, I have an explanatory clarification question, because your talk had two components, and you build a bridge between those two components. But I wish you could elaborate a little bit on what the connector was. So the first part of your lecture, you elaborated some more general problems relating to liberal woke ideology, and you ideologically positioned yourself in general terms as a Burkean liberal conservative. And in the second part of the lecture, you turned to female conservative leadership in Europe, and you mentioned various examples. But there's a bridge there where you think these female conservative leaders are particularly well placed to act upon the current ideological landscape. But what was your argument there exactly?
Simply, I think on the culture war stuff, I think women are just they seem best placed to talk about the issues about family education. It's sort of their domain, I suppose. I can't think of an example of a man successfully speaking out against the trans issues.
Okay, the men are because of the associations that people have with men and with women, perhaps men overall get less slack when they criticize, for instance, the new trans activism from the right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that everybody should be able to criticize, anything. But if we're really talking about trying to win, and really get some sanity back in politics, we have to think strategy. And women will just have an easier time talking about, it goes to immigration. They can call it out better and, say that radical Islam is potentially eroding women's rights, or it could. And they're less likely to be called racist than if a man said it, I think.
Oh yeah, okay. That's
they get an easier
helpful
pass. Yeah,
no, I think I get it now. It's a bit sad for the man, but it's great that we can that women will have have their moment to shine then.
Yes,
that's great. Okay, that makes sense. Let's turn to the audience. I'm sure that there are a lot of questions. We covered a lot of ground. Chung, you're getting the mic.
Thank you very much for the very much electrifying talk. Now, as a student of conservatism, and I think that the greatest challenge that any conservative face is, to what extent can you reconcile modernity with tradition? And you've illustrated the challenge very well in that there are two fronts in which conservatives are fighting against. One is wokeism, which is a radical movement towards the progressive, and radical Islam, which is a radical movement towards the regressive. So, to what extent are the new conservative women in a unique position to reconcile the tradition or pre-modernity and modernity together? Thank you.
Yes, this is a very good question. I think if you start simply by just taking a number of the issues, the concrete issues, so immigration for one, women can speak to that in a way that I just mentioned, maybe more easily than men can. The family, gender. I think you have to take each issue on a case-by-case basis. I don't think any of these, because they are politicians, I don't think any of them should have a philosophy of conservatism, if that makes sense. And my own philosophy of conservatism is one which is anti-ideological. So it's skeptical, and it really does take everything on a case-by-case basis. But at the same time, tradition is very important there. So I suppose any woman or politician or figure who maybe just is focused on preserving that tradition, or even less, even just stopping what I see as an iconoclastic movement. So the woke want to tear everything down. Islam wants to, I suppose, tear it down and replace it with something else. The woke, I don't think that they know what they want to replace it with. Just non-white men, I don't know. They don't have an answer. Islam, of course, does have an answer, and we know what that looks like. So I would say, maybe something like anti-ideology, but anti-West, and Western traditions. And you can use Christianity here, of course. Many conservatives do. That can be a useful tool, but it's not necessary, but helpful. Yeah.
But if Christianity is useful here as a tool, how does that relate to your statement in your talk that God is dead, in the sense that we no longer believe in the West, supposedly in the metaphysical foundations that came with Christianity?
Yeah. So I meant that, maybe it wasn't so clear, but I meant it in terms of the way that their argument, you can't argue with them. You can't argue, once you erase truth, and you just see any opinion, like it's relativism, it's just all an opinion. Everything is a belief. So if you posit, a belief in God, that's just one of many beliefs. They say that these are all on the same metaphysical plane, and power is what defines the difference between beliefs. That's how they're ordered in a sort of hierarchical way. And so, because one is disenfranchised or one is oppressed by another one, then they can assert their belief as the correct one, or the one that we must take, and they do this in the name of social justice. So that's sort of what I meant, is that you can't argue with them. But I do think, in philosophy at least, I mean, we are well in the postmodern age. I think belief is completely separate. So I'm talking really philosophically here. I'm talking about argument. Basically, I think that I think that came to my mind when I was writing this, because when I look at people like, say, Christopher Rousseau, for example, a lot of Americans who work on woke and the culture war, they seem to me to be sort of like fighting fire with fire. So they're still operating in the same logic as the woke. Yeah. And I don't think that's productive. I don't think that's useful. And for example, I don't think that, I think Rousseau wanted to ban some books, ban woke books, and things like that. And once you start getting into that territory, I think that's, I don't like that. And I think it comes from still operating in their philosophical mode. It's too ideological for me.
More questions from the audience. Oh, here,
Is that on? No. Is that on?
Not really, no.
Never mind, I'm loud enough. Okay. I've attended a lot of the center right presentations here. That's why I'm here. And I think what you're carving out for women is quite critical, and what you've done tonight is something unique here, which is showing the way for women to be able to say certain things that men cannot say as successfully. And by also focusing on being a woman, moving away from the gender wars to a woman and those values, I think you are showing something here that we don't hear hardly at all. I mean, we do hear it a bit when you listen to Maloney or somebody like that. I didn't even know this woman existed, by the way, till tonight. But I think I would really like to see people like you write more so that we have some thought leadership in this. You're rather complicated or complex, right? But it needs to be reduced down for the average person to be able to see that there's certain values, there's a certain way forward. Not everything is a conflict. Not everything is as you talk about banning books. Anyway, if you could just speak to that about what is the way forward for the center right that could be led by women. If you could just add just a little more, please.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, and that's exactly what I intend to do, and what I should do. And any thoughts that you have would be helpful. I think the center right needs to realize, one, that women can be very, very useful, but also they need to be open to women making the point that on the transgender issue, for example, right, this cuts across the political spectrum, it really cuts across. So I suppose being a bit more open, for one. We can, what is the harm in agreeing with Germaine Greer? I don't see any harm. I don't know if they are closed to this. I just think that they haven't thought about it, really, at all. So, and so that's something for women to think about, how conservative women themselves, to draw attention to the fact that, yeah, we are all in this together on a lot of points. And that's, so I suppose picking out those things. So the trans thing is clearly one. The trans issue is also one of reality, which is again complicated. But if you focus on the trans, then you're getting into the education. You're getting into children education. You're getting into that as a topic. And immigration. I mean, I don't know. I think just pulling apart these issues and showing how women are best placed to talk about them. I don't know. I will get back to you on that. My brain is still buzzing.
Hayden, you had a question.
Okay. My question is, how do you reclaim feminism from relativism? Because I think when relativism prevails, feminism has minimal meaning. Because you can say, what is feminism? What's a woman? So there has to be some meaning reinstalled. I'm curious how you would go about doing that.
Yeah, for sure. I think you begin with biology. Absolutely. So before the trans stuff became a big thing in the past few years, I mean, I didn't really know what, if you asked me what feminism was, say in 2020 or something, or before then, I would say, I don't know. I think that it's largely, at least in Australia, and I think in the West, it's achieved what it set out to achieve, which for me was first wave feminism. Women are almost at an advantage now, in many ways. I think that they are. And so that's why it's interesting that now we are, again, I feel the need to talk about feminism, because I think feminism, and that's why you see Germaine Greer, these feminists from the 70s, looking at all of the work that they did, now undone almost overnight by men, in dresses, when we really, if we are frank about it. So I think, biology. Let's start with biology,
Have more questions in the audience? Comments? Yeah, yes, I see that you... No?
Just smiling happily.
Oh, smiling happily, that's always good. Oh, yes, sir. Excellent tie, by the way. We're competing over who has the most outrageous tie here. There's very broad ties. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes? So,
I am stuck a bit on the subject of banning books. So, and also woke women becoming conservative. What I am noticing, woke women become conservative to protect their children. In the US, for example, if they feel that the schools are doing porno programs and they're bringing the trans shows and so on. And as far as banning, that's one. So what do you think about that? And as far as banning books, I go back to the Nazis and the burning of the books, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about banning specific classes of books, mainly porno or really bad stuff, in libraries where minors have access. Is this what you mean?
May I just before you respond, Lana, say that as someone who's did some teaching in high school level, if getting kids to read these days is very hard with all the distractions from the screens. So it's not as if like all our young teenagers are drawn to pornographic novels. I don't think they read much. So So, but theoretically they could be looking at pornographic novels. But I'm not sure if that ever happens anymore, right?
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
The microphone.
Oh, microphone. Yeah.
That's an interesting comment. However, we're talking about specific activist, woke, liberal, left teachers that don't care about the kids picking up a book in the library. They shove it in the face with the pictures of, sex, masturbation, whatever, at an age when they truly shouldn't have access to that. Just a comment.
No, it's a very, very good point. And I've done some work on this in Australia because, but I'm very familiar with what has happened in America. I think that the problem, I would prefer to start with the schools, with the curriculum. So in Australia, I work on the curriculum. So why on earth are these topics really on the curriculum at schools? Why they're being taught anyway? So that's number one. That's how you sort of get the rot out. I'm very averse to banning anything. Is the thing. I think that I do know, and I just realize this now, in Hungary you do have a ban on these books in libraries, I think, or sort of, yeah. I did see that in America they were banning literature. They had a problem distinguishing between something that is pornographic in preschools or something, and something like Lolita by Nabokov. So I don't think I think Lolita should be in high schools. I think that's okay. I think that's reasonable. I wrote on Lolita when I was at school. So I think once you start banning, it's too. It can go badly. So I think start with the curriculum, and then again, and with the internet, it's difficult. If a child wants to look something up, I mean, they will. It's up to the parents to police this. So yeah, start with schools.
To comment on that, in Hungary, you have organizations that are called Tankerület. It's basically started a couple of years ago. We organized mainly by Fidesz. And these are basically organizations that totally control the curriculum in schools. They're called Tankerület. Sometimes I see them as extremely bureaucratic from the old regime, but doesn't matter. You cannot get any books into any curriculum if the town cabinet does not approve it. That's a fact. You can check that. I have teacher friends. So in Hungary, they do have this barrier. As long as the town cabinet is controlled, at this time it's controlled by Fidesz. Fidesz has this policy of gyermekvédelem, the protection of the children, that we know very well. They keep coming from the EU here trying to bust us on that. It will be part of the fight that will take place in the next couple of months, trying to bring down Hungary in their position of being on the top when they take over the control. So here, just as a comment, in Hungary, the town cabinet are the ones that protect the schools.
Yeah, I think that does sound quite good, as long as the person in control of this can be trusted. And I think, yeah, I don't know if that would be possible in a place like Australia. I just don't think they would ever go for it.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah.
Anything else, perhaps more generally on conservative female leadership? Yes, stand up. State your name and state your name and your affiliation, please.
Yeah, I'm Esther Szigeti, a new intern at the Danube Institute, and I would say two things. First, I think you haven't mentioned the question of abortion, and I think that's a very interesting topic for conservative women to discuss, and I would love to hear your personal opinion about the question of women and the conservative or the Christian approach of the problem of abortion. I think Erin Haley is a very interesting person to mention here about the abortion pill case in the US lately. And the other thing I would be interested in, that do you think there's a key or a common thing that can help a woman to be successful within the conservative renewal? You mentioned several women, and I would love to know if there's something common within each of them, according to your opinion. Is there something that can make a woman successful or credible within the conservatism, and also before the society as a conservative woman, leader woman? Thank you.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Very, very good. So your second point, question first. I plan to try to ask these women that question. So part of my project is that I want to go and talk to these women and see what they're about, and see what they have to say. So yeah, I hope to find out. I think it depends on the country, really. In more traditional conservative countries, maybe it's better if they present themselves perhaps in a more traditional manner. But I really think that it's pretty free at the moment. I think as long as they're good, they'll be okay. But yes, I plan to find out. On abortion, I suppose I did think about maybe mentioning this in the talk, or it crossed my mind when I was writing the talk. And I think that the right need to, in Europe, so America is different, but in Europe I think the right need to get pretty pragmatic on abortion. And I think that what happened in Poland showed that. So I think that the Law and Justice Party, I think the way that they cracked down on abortion was was really politically bad for them. I think it was political suicide. I don't think that they really needed to do that. And that really contributed to their loss, I think. So, I mean, my personal view on abortion aside, you know, and conservatives aside, I think that the threat of this woke takeover is so serious that we have to start playing real politic. So you win, you win some, you lose some. Maybe just don't talk about abortion so much, you know, because you need to get into power. So I think that, you know, on these, you know, issues like that in Europe are maybe not as controversial as they once were, or that abortion is more accepted now. It's same with the gay stuff. It's sort of like, you know, okay, we'll let it go a bit. Yeah, it depends how conservative you are, I suppose. But I do think that the conservatives need to entertain the possibility of loosening up a little bit on certain issues in order to gain and retain power and keep power. That would be my perspective. Maybe one example in Australia was we had the gay marriage plebiscite, so it's a vote on gay marriage a few years back. And I, for example, I voted no. It won. And now we do have gay marriage. I voted no because I see gay marriage as iconoclastic. So if you were gay, I don't understand why you would want to get married. And I see it as the left wanting to tear down an institution. But I didn't mind that it passed, whatever. And I think most Australians felt that way. You know, okay, we are okay with homosexuality now. It's been legal for, you know, ages. But when it came to the voice, for example, dividing us by race, this was next level. This was a new, really seriously woke, separate identity politics, and Australia said no to that. So I think you need to choose the conservatives need to choose their battles wisely, if they want to make a go of it, and yeah, particularly in Europe.
Yeah, probably one of those, I think you've indicated that one of the important fights is the fight for maintaining the differentiation between biological sex and gender identity, and stressing that in many categories, in many social systems, in many of the domains of modern social life and the state bureaucracy, we are going to have to focus on biological sex and not on gender identity. So that would be one of those key issues you're focused on. And what were the other ones? I think this was the main one.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I'm not sort of like obsessed with the trans or anything. I mean, I find talking about it all quite gruesome, you know, really. It's not a particularly fun thing to talk about. But I just think it's the strongest thing that conservatives have going for them, or women in particular at the moment, because it is, of all the woke things, it is the one that is so most obviously crazy, you know, just at face value, and visible. And you know, putting men in women's prisons is outrageous. So I think that it's a good starting point, I suppose, and so that's why I think it's come out as major. But I don't like. I'd rather talk about other things, I suppose. But I just think it's too strong, and it shouldn't be ignored. Yeah.
More questions from the audience. I think we're a little bit. How are we in the time? Oh, we're actually about on time. Yeah, this is. Well, then I thank everyone for coming, and I please give a round of applause for our for Lana Starkey.
I might say with IOSU on the screen, if anybody knows a betting website or app that they use in Hungary, I'd like to know, because I do bet on politics. I won on Trump and I won on Brexit. So for whenever I can bet on this, when it comes up,
Okay. Great. Have a good evening, everyone.